we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the show. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time listening, welcome. If it's not your first time listening, welcome back. I always like to say, please rate the video if you like it. Follow us, subscribe to the podcast, hit the bell so you get the notifications on YouTube. You can find us anywhere on any platform. Tell your friends if you like what you hear, and we want to spread the word. If you tell one friend, we'll double the podcast. So we love you out there, and thank you so much. Thank you everyone for supporting. Shout out Pops, thanks for the new shirt. It's late Tuesday night, and I'm doing this recording, and it's interesting with these ones. I'm always interested, and I like I said, I was up to when people rate the podcast. Everyone's been rating, and thank you so much, everyone's rating. We love you. We still love you for everything. It makes a big difference when you guys spread the word, no matter what rating you give. It's something that, when I do these solo ones, I kind of do them, based on my own kind of interests. And I know that there's probably some of these topics that not everyone's necessarily interested in, but you know what? I know that it's something that I like and something that I'm passionate about. And, I think that that's the only way I can continue to do these is to continue to just do what I'm interested in. And, it will attract the people who want to watch and want to listen. And, it'll also hopefully, spread some knowledge. And that's my biggest goal, is that some of these topics are, not necessarily in everyone's wheelhouse, but that hopefully in listening to some of them, people get a little bit of a different experience, a little bit of different knowledge, who knows, right? And that's what I always like to say, write in, please comment on the videos, shoot me a message on Instagram at the Bigmark Podcast or at the Bigmark Pod on Twitter. And, it's all about like kind of creating, a little bit of discourse, a little bit of discussion. And a little bit about today's kind of focus is mostly about this documentary called The 7-5. It's done by Tiller Russell. He's a great filmmaker. I actually just listened to a podcast of his the other day, which was really good. And I had watched this documentary a long time ago. I don't know if it's still on Netflix, but I remember watching it a long time ago when it first kind of came on. And, it's just a fascinating story, all about police corruption in New York City in the 1980s. And, obviously there's kind of a lot going on with police today, and it's really tough for anyone out there, all the first responders, especially in today's time. But, it's just, a lot of people have kind of looked at police officers in kind of more of a negative light recently. And, we need someone to uphold the law that has studied it and understands it and has the authority to. And yes, maybe, or there has definitely been circumstances where police officers have pushed some boundaries there, of course, to fatal effect, to fatal outcomes, and that's horrible and that's tragic. And I'm so sorry to all the families who have ever had to deal with any of this. But then there's many police officers that saved many people's lives and continue to do so. Unfortunately, today's topic is going to kind of explore a little bit more of that dark underbelly. Again, this is New York City in the 80s. New York City in the 80s was a lot different than New York City of today. Well, I don't even know if I should be saying that. In fact, actually, it sounds like New York of today is a little bit closer to what New York of the 80s used to be. Unfortunately, in the aftermath of COVID, it sounds like the city is kind of in deep trouble. But again, at this point in New York City, it was essentially the murder capital of the world. There was about 3,500 murders per year in New York City, and one of the police officers basically described some parts of New York City that they looked like Beirut. Buildings bombed out, empty, abandoned. People just running electricity straight from the like transformer right to their house. It was just kind of a desolate place, and it was really a result of kind of the crack epidemic, and crack started becoming popular, and it was decimating people's lives, and people were dealing it and getting serious jail time, and everything was kind of back and forth with the police because of it, and it was really, really a terrible thing. There's actually a really, really interesting story about that that I'll probably end up doing a podcast on someday, but that whole idea that how crack was introduced into these cities, and it's kind of chilling. But the story of the 7-5, which describes the 75th precinct in New York City, the main character, if you will, is Michael Dowd. He's kind of this character where, I did a podcast on The Sopranos the other day, and I don't know if it's the writing or the acting or something about Tony Soprano. There's something about Tony Soprano that's endearing, and that you tend to root for him. Yes, there's points where you question that, but at the end of the day, you kind of want him to win. And that's that anti-hero vibe where, we can kind of, I believe it's based on the fact that we can kind of see a reflection of ourselves in these people, right? Because we're all a reflection of each other. When we see these more negative characters, that does reflect that more negative aspect of ourselves. Not that we necessarily want to feed into that and become a negative character. It's just the fact that, we are that balance of good and evil, or good and bad, I should say, resides in all of us. And seeing characters like this kind of, make you want to, are very interesting. When you see characters like this, they're at least very interesting and intriguing. And then obviously past Tony Soprano, you kind of get into characters where there's not a lot of redeeming qualities and they just seem to be terrible. I wouldn't necessarily say Mike Dowd's fully terrible, but I'd say more so that he's just the kind of guy that saw opportunities and took them. And unfortunately, a lot of those opportunities were highly illegal. And, we'll get into the story. So Michael Dowd was a New York police officer for about 10 years. He joined the force when he was about 22. He went on to commit hundreds of thefts, extortions, narcotics trafficking, protecting drug operations, encouraging personal drug use. This guy was essentially just a wild man and was the epitome of the crooked cop. And I think again, this will all kind of tie back to this whole idea of the crack epidemic was causing all this dissent, not only within criminals, but also within police, because there was so much crime going on. There was so much then opportunity for these cops to go bad and to become crooked. So, like I said, we revolve around the 75th precinct in East New York, in Brooklyn. like I mentioned about New York City, about 3,500 murders a year in the 7-5 precinct alone. There was about 100 murders. About 100 murders a month there, just in the 7-5 precinct. It's the deadliest precinct in the country in the 80s. Highest murder rate in the country. Basically, everyone had guns. One of the police officers described it as the land of fuck. So essentially, it's just gone to shit, and there's not a lot of rules. And it's interesting because you have these police officers that want to hold up the law, but they're risking their lives. Police officers were getting shot on the daily. Well, maybe not on the daily, but a lot of police officers were getting shot and injured and killed on the job. And it was just extremely dangerous. And when I say opportunities present themselves, I mean, maybe you're going to bust someone and, they have a lot of money on them. Maybe you take that money and let them go, right? Because you want that money. Or, maybe you go bust someone and you find a huge bag of cash and drugs. Maybe there's 10 kilos in there and you only tell everyone that you found 9. Obviously this is going directly against what police officers want to do. And this, again, just speaks to the fact that police officers are just human beings. And we trust them to be unbiased, and we trust them to be truthful to the oath that they take and to protect and serve people. But again, I think when there's this drug that gets introduced to the community and you have all these people, excuse me. Yeah, sorry about that. You have all these people that, when crime comes into play, especially organized crime that kind of surrounds drug trafficking and drug usage and production and all that stuff, it essentially creates a small economy in itself. And I think it's really interesting in these scenarios. And I don't know if anyone's ever watched The Wire. The Wire kind of touches on some of these ideas that there is this perpetual battle kind of between the police and these drug dealers, and the fact that the drug dealers are just trying to support themselves, support their lives. They've grown up into a society, and they've grown up in a scenario, and there's been generations of people who've lived through this now, and that's all they know. And they've only figured out ways how to get away from the police, and they just see the police in a way that's not helpful. And it's not, and it's it's a part of society that, the police aren't there to help you. They're there to put you in jail, take you away, in some instances, unfortunately now, hurt you more than they should. And that's terrible because, again, you just have to have a balance there. And I think obviously with all this drug crime, it all surrounds, drug laws and stuff. And that's a whole another idea. I don't want to go too much into that. But again, this whole idea that, this is just going to be a perpetual issue, and that police are just going to be constantly fighting this. It was there was no other place that it was more evident than 1980s New York and the 7-5 precinct. So one of the other main characters of the story is Kenny Urel. He's an Irish Catholic guy from New York, from Brooklyn. He became a became a cop because he didn't really know what else to do. He said he would have become a firefighter if the test was before, but he wrote the police test first. He got in, so then he became a cop. Him and Michael Dowd essentially become partners and go on to commit many crimes together. But Kenny's whole story is that he was really kind of coerced into joining, but Michael seemed to persuade him. But there were so many other factors that, Kenny could have been doing this himself too. But anyway, we'll get into that later. Kenny and Mike met each other in the police academy, and they talk about this in the documentary, where there's integrity training, right, in the police academy, where they come in, they tell you, to avoid all these opportunities I'm talking about that come up, how to stay a police officer that's staying true to their word and true to their story, and true to their job, and not hurting anyone and not harassing anybody. And people from internal affairs would come and talk to all the recruits, and obviously police academy is a way to get to know your fellow officers. It's a lot about camaraderie, and you want to trust, everyone beside you. Again, these police officers are facing danger at every, could you imagine, especially now, all these stories, getting out of your car and, going and having to pull someone over and not knowing whether they have a weapon, and whether or not, with all this other stuff, they're ready to fight, or even they're going to be an asshole to you. And again, I understand no one, a lot of people have problem with authority, and no one likes party poopers and stuff. But again, the police are there to take care of you. You know what I mean? And unfortunately, in certain areas of the world, they're not seen that way as much. But in the police academy, again, they're learning that they got to have each other's back. So when they are worried about all this stuff, at least when they have their partner in the cruiser with them, that's something that's going to give them some hope and some comfort, and they have the same training and all that stuff. Obviously, we know what police academies do, of course. But like I said, they'd have people come in from internal affairs and talk to these recruits and say, listen, you guys got to be careful what you do. Don't take any money. Don't take any bribes. Make sure everything you find, you catalog properly. You follow all the rules, blah, blah, blah. Essentially, the internal affairs people come in, they'd give that whole spiel, they'd leave, and then the training officers from the academy would basically come in and say, forget all that, this is how you do it. And it was basically all about cover your own ass so you don't have to deal with internal affairs. If your partner says they saw blue and it was green, if they say they saw blue, you say you saw blue. It's all about, being a good cop. And essentially a good cop isn't just someone who's doing their job right. It's someone who's not going to give up another cop. It's going to go along with whatever another officer says, no matter what. And it's essentially a survival mechanism. I totally get that. Obviously, like I said, you're out there, you're worried about things, certain things happen in situations that are out of your control. But because you're a police officer, a lot of people are going to take your word. So again, there's just so much room for error, and it just takes such a strong person to properly follow and be a proper cop, not just a quote unquote good cop, as they say here. And when you don't go along with this narrative, if you're a new recruit and you come in, you say, no, I'm going to follow the rules, I'm going to do everything right, I'm going to tell internal affairs when I see one of my fellow officers breaking rules, that and other police officers realize that you're not a good cop. maybe they're going to be slower to react if something happens. Maybe they're not going to call in something happening on the radio just right away if you get shot or you get injured, or maybe your back is turned in the wrong way, and things happen, right? Accidents happen. So again, it's not to say that there's a lot of these accidents that happen. It's just these are what new recruits have in the back of their mind. They don't want to be deemed a bad cop, because they obviously don't want to be treated in a negative way, but they also want to be accepted by their peers. And I can't imagine how jocular it is, but just because it's just a high stress, it's paramilitary in that sense, where there's a lot of that kind of high testosterone behavior. And again, you want to support each other, and you want to show each other that if someone's staring down the barrel of the gun, that your partner is always gonna have your back. So like I mentioned, rookie cops usually are going to come in, they're going to bend over backwards to follow the rules. They're going to book everything that comes in. They're going to take their time. They're going to do it, and after a year or two, they're going to start seeing. So this is kind of generally what can happen, what could happen to a police officer joining. They're following the rules, they're being sticklers, and it's starting to wear on them a little bit. They've been driving in for 400 tours of duty. They've been out there. They're seeing that they're not stopping crime as much as they want. And that's, again, another aspect of the fact that they just kept feeding this crack epidemic, and it just was never going to stop. And as a police officer, maybe you're feeling underappreciated, and then, like I said, maybe you feel underpaid, and then you see an opportunity, and maybe you need a couple $100, and you're going to take it. So it's tough, again, when you're going to have to actually bring all this stuff out and write all this paperwork and create all this paperwork for all this evidence that you found. Are you going to do that? Or are you going to just, take some of that cash, or leave it and say, in Mike Dowd's case, leave it and then come back and try and steal it later. But not to be that extreme as Mike Dowd, but these simple little choices, it's almost like what Jordan Peterson always says about the Nazi guards, or the police officers in Germany that rounded up a lot of Jewish people, that we're not far from making these decisions. And a lot of these, again, every police officer is a human being, and a lot of these people that they probably go, and they're under tremendous amounts of stress. And it, again, like I said, it takes an extremely strong person, and they do exist. There's lots of great police officers out there, but it just shows you how easy it is for things to go sour. And I'm not necessarily talking about police abuse or anything like that, or police brutality or anything like that, but just necessarily corruption and things like this, where you hope for the best, but some of these things can turn very easily, and that's just kind of the human condition. So one of the first stories, or one of the first times that kind of broke, or not necessarily broke the camel's back, but really started pushing Mike into doing some dastardly crimes, is that Mike and his partner at the time, before he was with Kenny, actually rob a drug dealer. And they go in and they show him the badge, everything. They see all this stuff, and they just take it and they say, "It's your lucky day. You're not going to jail. We're just going to confiscate all the stuff." And then they just kept all the money. And again, what is it? The drug dealer is going to say, "Hey, these police officers stole all my money," and they're police officers. Everyone's going to take their word for it, right? So that was kind of what started, and that was kind of Mike's MO. He would go in there as a police officer, go in there and usually just confiscate the money and just kind of keep it for himself. So, while Mike was doing all this stuff in September of 1986, so I think Mike Dowd was in the police academy in 1982 or so. So while Mike was a police officer, 13 other police officers were arrested on corruption charges in the 77th precinct. So a close precinct to the 7-5, the 7-7. Some officers were borrowing ladders and hatchets from firefighters to raid drug homes. So it was easy to catch these guys. These guys were barbaric. And a lot of the officers hearing about this at the 7-5 kind of resigned to avoid the scandal. And Mike Dowd was the only police officer who didn't resign. And he just relied on the hope that no other police officer is going to turn him in. And that was that whole idea of being a good cop. And a lot of cops just lived up to that and probably gritted and bared their teeth and just watched this guy commit all these crimes, or just kind of, again, just kept that code. And it's oddly honorable in a sense, but it's sad because of Mike's kind of had that kind of more twisted idea of that loyalty to police officers, and was he just manipulating the system and just hoping that they wouldn't turn him in, or does he actually truly believe that as a police officer he's just messing with drug dealers, he's not hurting anybody? Who knows? So like I mentioned before, when Kenny started joining Mike and doing some of this stuff, Kenny really makes it seem that Mike really had to work hard to get Kenny to break the law. But again, Kenny wasn't making a whole lot of money at the time, and I think that was a lot more tempting. So as you'll see more when Kenny Urel is joining in doing more stuff with Mike, it's I think Kenny, in hindsight, is trying to make himself look a little bit better. But hey, what can you do? Another person who kind of was major in this story, his name is Joe Hall. He's a homicide detective in the 7-5, and he was trying to take down Cello, who's a Dominican gangster in La Campana, which is like basically their family, the company it's a small drug dealing outfit full of Dominican dudes, and like these guys were wild. So Joe and one of his partners were surveilling these guys, Cello and the Dominican and La Campana's kind of hideout. And as they kind of noticed that they were being seen, they're pulling out, and all the gang members started grabbing guns and shot at them and chased them for a few blocks. The officers had to like kind of sprint to the precinct and hide out because they're just getting followed. Meanwhile, Mike and Kenny were working with Barron, who was a member of La Campana. So these gang members that were shooting at their fellow officers, Mike and Kenny were already working with these dudes. And Mike at one point Mike and Kenny work out a deal that they're going to kind of provide information to La Campana and say, watch out if something's going down, and kind of be a little bit of a police presence. And they're supposed to pay them money too. So Mike and Kenny were getting paid. And one time they short them some money. They don't pay them all the money that they should have. And Mike just like sat out front of their drug dealing spot and just was harassing everybody. And so they put a hit out on Mike. La Campana says, Cello says, we got to shoot this guy. Mike ends up confronting Cello in the street and says, like, you want to kill me? Like, let's fight right now. So Cello goes back, tells Barron the hit's off. Again, this is just wildness. This is all crazy stuff. So, like I said, La Campana is kind of a lower level street level crew. While Mike's dealing with all this stuff, he's gaining a reputation within the crime world that he's going to be a cop that you want to have around. He's someone that's there to protect you, and he's on the take. He gets it. So Adam Diaz steps into the mix, and he's the boss of basically the company's like supplier gang, the Diaz organization. He moved much larger volumes and basically was the supplier to La Campagna, but they worked together very closely. To put it in perspective, in 1987, when this was all happening, the price of a kilo of cocaine was about $34,000. When he was 20, Diaz was moving about 300 kilos a week. So he was making millions of dollars a year. And Barron basically introduces Mike to Adam and says, Mike, are you going to help? Adam says to Mike, are you going to help me, look after my business and everything? And Mike says, listen, we'll watch over all the drug deals. We'll watch over your crew. We'll tell you if there's undercover officers around. If we need to provide basically police escorts, they would, right? So for $24,000 down to $8,000 a week, to inform Diaz, Mike and Kenny were making this money. When Diaz was working with Mike, he never really thought that Mike was really a police officer. He's kind of had that vibe of always that he was a criminal. And it's really interesting that Diaz says that, because actually another officer from Internal Affairs mentions a very similar description of Mike, which is very interesting. Diaz was really cocky about having the police in his pocket. He got it. It was like, it was a good look for him to be like, hey, I'm powerful. I have the police in my pocket. They do what I tell them to. He basically, at one point, Mike gave the Diaz organization police issue bulletproof vests, and they wore them with pride. Look at, the police are even giving us gifts. It's like, it was freaking twisted. And one time Mike tipped off Diaz to a bust that saved him $500,000 in coke. Again, this is Mike was valuable. He was helping. While this was happening, Mike and Kenny actually started conducting robberies for the Diaz organization. So the Diaz organization would go and they'd say, I have all these rival gangs and we got to take them out. Mike and Kenny and their crew would actually get the locations from the narcotics unit and go scope out the locations. So they would use the resources of the police department to go find these locations to rob, find these rival drug dealers. When they were all on duty, their little crew of crooked cops would all be on duty, and they'd go and perform these robberies. And if someone called in a robbery to the police, they would be the responding unit. So they would just pretend that they were just responding instead of the ones that actually were performing the robbery. And they would use police tactics, stuff that they learned in the academy, to protect themselves and basically take these people by by complete surprise. Sorry, I got a frog in my throat today. Basically, people take these people by complete surprise, which is completely wild. It was you could tell Mike was starting to kind of blur the lines between, who was his real employer. Was it the NYPD or the drug dealers that paid him? He said sometimes, because he was getting paid so much by these drug dealers, sometimes he would forget to pick up his paycheck at the police station. So, this guy was living above his means, living large, vacations, gambling, jewelry for his wife. He bought a new red Corvette, crazy thing. And again, this is a police officer. He's not supposed to be making that much money at this time. I'm pretty sure he was just like a police officer. He wasn't like a sergeant or like a captain or like whatever the really high rankings are that make a lot of money. And, he's ripping in this red Corvette. And it's like, bro, come on. During this time, a transit officer named Robert Venable was actually killed by members of La Campagna. So this is the thing, like, what are you? Are you a cop or are you a drug dealer? Mike Dowd and Kenny have to make that decision, right? It's what are you doing that's, even remotely close to saving these people? You're helping and you are aiding these people that are also killing one of your fellow officers. Very, very conflicted. At one point, Mike Dowd is asked whether he considers himself a New York City cop or a drug trafficker, and he admits to saying both. He thinks he's both. So, a character conflicted. Again, think what you will about Mike Dowd, but a character conflicted indeed. So the kind of impetus for this whole thing kind of come crashing down. There was an inside informant working with Detective Joe Hall, and he told him that Diaz was working with a cop named Mike the Cop, and he drives a red Corvette. So, Joe Hall's thinking, okay, what the hell's going on here? It's obviously Mike Dowd, and they basically tie him to about 30 other officers. Internal Affairs kind of takes things over there. Of course, Joe Tromboli is another one of the officers working on things. When at one point he walks by Mike Dowd in the precinct, and as he's walking by him, he looks at him, and the feeling that he gets is perp. He doesn't get a feeling that he's a police officer, even though he's in uniform. And Officer Tromboli was always really conflicted about that because, again, obviously his feelings were correct. Inside Affairs followed him on duty, off duty. It's obviously very hard to follow a cop because they know when they're being followed, especially Mike Dowd, and he's being extremely paranoid. Officer Tromboli was kind of talking about how heartbreaking it is for other police officers to bust a cop. It's really tough because, they took this oath to give their lives to protect, and, none of that meant anything to Mike. And it was really, it was tough. Even though, who knows, when you look at Mike, maybe he did understand that, but he exploited it. There's no doubt. Again, I think all of this was surrounding this crack epidemic. It's a secondary and tertiary effect of this whole thing. The crack operations by the CIA, bringing them in. Like I mentioned, I'll probably do another podcast about that, but bringing this drug into the country and spreading this in to kind of disrupt socioeconomic happenings, just awful. But this is what happens, is it's not only going to affect the people that are doing the drugs and selling the drugs, it's also going to affect all these police officers that are going to have to try to uphold these laws that maybe weren't necessarily created with the best intentions. And that's a really tough pill to swallow because, there's no such thing as a bad drug. A drug is an inert, or is a compound. It has no sentience in it itself. It just depends on how you use it. And yeah, maybe some drugs can make people lose control, but if they were regulated and if they were looked after by a governing body, we'd get clean drugs. We'd have more information about them, how to use them, and then more information about how to deal with someone who does get into some trouble. But because all this stuff is illegal, you can't do any of this. You can't get into these talks and even, research. And luckily now, with psychedelics becoming allowed to be researched a little bit more, it's helping. But even all these drugs, again, there's no such thing as a bad drug. And it's the media that's really changed our perception in how what these drugs actually do to to people. But Because if this drug wasn't illegal anymore, all these cops wouldn't be dying and getting killed and having all this uphill climb. It's totally whole other subject. I got to do another podcast on it. Trust me. So, and again, Mike never really felt bad because all he was doing was just fucking over some lowly drug dealer in his mind. So this is what it is that it makes these people who are involved in this drugs seem like lesser people, and then others view them as a person to exploit. It's just not fair. Mike Dowd started getting addicted to cocaine and alcohol during this time. Obviously, he's living wild. He's living at the top. He's living on in the red zone, man. So he needs to something to kind of like deal with all that, I'm sure. And obviously, he started making bad decisions, started acting irrationally. But he always just fell back on that whole idea that no cop is ever going to turn him in. Because of Mike's irrational behavior, because he was doing all these drugs, Kenny's obviously, his partner's getting worried. And, they talk about it a little bit in the film. Mike and Kenny are partners, but it's almost like a marriage. You have to trust your partner with everything you have, and they did trust each other. And like as much, even if Kenny was persuaded to join, when he was in 110%, and he kept things tight because Mike was crazy. He kept things tight. So he was obviously worried about Mike with all this drug use. But more importantly, the Diaz organization was starting to get a little bit worried about Mike's behavior. Obviously, they know he's going to get irrational. Maybe he's going to flip. Maybe he's going to do whatever, right? And that's not a good look. So, May 1992, it's about 10 years into this whole charade. Suffolk County Narcotics raid Kenny's house. So they bust in, they bust down the door. They're looking for the money. They know they got the money. Internal Affairs orders a mandatory drug test for Mike, and then they arrest him for narcotics conspiracy. While they're out on bail, so they get arrested, they get out on bail. Mike and Kenny plan to kidnap a rival drug dealer's wife and rob them, and skip out on bail. So while this is all happening, they're planning on a kidnapping, and supposed to be giving this person over to the Diaz company. But before like about a month before the kidnapping, the DEA approaches Kenny's lawyer and tells them they actually have a federal case against Diaz and La Compañía, and they are all completely involved in it. And they have a federal case against them. They've been taping all the events, and again, Kenny and everybody, including Mike, obviously are facing federal charges. So Kenny flips, he starts cooperating, and he starts wearing a wire. It comes around to the night of the actual kidnapping. Kenny and Mike they're driving there. Kenny's wearing a wire. They turn on the police scanner, and Mike hears that the street is under surveillance by the DEA, and he friggin' bails, and he starts flipping out. He's so suspicious. He knows someone flipped for sure. He's tripping. But Kenny had all the right answers, so he didn't suspect him right away. In July of that same year, 1992, so a couple months later, the DEA arrested Mike Dowd with Kenny's help. The Mullen Commission fined dozens of other police officers guilty of corruption, and Michael Dowd was convicted of racketeering and conspiracy to distribute narcotics, and he served 12 years in prison. Tiller Russell, the filmmaker, spoke with Mike Dowd recently, and Mike Dowd says nothing's changed. All the same corruption stuff, even though there's been an arrest, even though there's been the same stuff. I guess at least in New York City, it's all the same. And, you know, again, it's this never-ending battle of good and evil, and I obviously don't support these officers that become corrupt, but I kind of understand, because, you know, you want to have this camaraderie, you want to have this loyalty, you want to prove to all your fellow police officers that you're a good cop. But it's such a slippery slope, and, you know, we need the strongest of individuals, not only physically but mentally, to be able to overcome some of these things with compassion and with empathy. Strength doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be cold and calculated. It's more so upholding that law in the sense that they're understanding why these people are maybe inherently breaking the law. Maybe as a society we can get over some of these drug issues, and we can start focusing on more nefarious shit, where that's actually, you know, murders and, you know, stuff that's, you know, corporate crimes even, right? Like that are affecting global economies and stuff like that. And then start shifting the whole mindset that, you know, whether it's drug use or whether it's mental health, that, you know, these people need help, and it's not necessarily the solution to just throw them in jail and hope that they're going to just figure it out. Because a lot of people, especially if they're addicted to a drug, the last place that they should be is just going cold turkey. I mean, not a lot of drugs can kill you in withdrawal, but this is the thing, you know, the drugs aren't necessarily the reason why people are like this. You know, the drugs maybe are there to try and mitigate some of the pain and suffering that they go through on a daily life. But, you know, it's like Superman said, the never-ending battle between good and evil. And not that it's a, you know, kabuki or anything like that, or some type of strange theater, but, you know, maybe we need this kind of back and forth that exists, and there is some darkness and there is some good that has to kind of ebb and flow. And I don't know, take that as you will, but, you know, there's something about that where, you know, we need, it's, to make a crude sports analogy, we need the referees out there, because everyone's just going to go out there and break any of the rules and not really follow them, because we're humans, and that's what we do. We want to push the boundaries, and some people don't agree with some of the laws that were created. And, you know, obviously from murder to, you know, jaywalking, you know, and it's a hell of a fucking continuum. But, you know, a lot of people draw the line at different parts there where they're willing to, quote unquote, you know, break the law. So empathy, love, lead with compassion. You know, not all cops are terrible people. And, you know, thank you to all the police officers out there that put your lives on the line and, you know, work hard. And shout out to all my friends who are out there and, you know, risking their lives and putting their lives and asses on the line. You know, we need you out there. And yeah, I think that's how you got to do it. Like I said, lead with love and empathy, and understand that, you know, on both sides, we need to be doing that same thing. And hopefully we'll make steps forward as a society to start getting out of some of these really heavy duty drug war policies, and it'll just make life a lot easier. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. You know, like I said, rate the podcast. We love you all. Thank you so much. Follow us on Instagram at the Bigmark Pod, and on our Twitter at the Bigmark Podcast. Check out our Patreon. You can support the podcast there. Patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. And yeah, tell your friends. We love you so much. Spread the word. And take care of yourselves out there. Stay safe. We love you. Peace.